Welcome to COIQ, where you learn how health innovators maximize their success. I'm your host, Dr. Roxy, founder of Legacy DNA and international best-selling author of How Health Innovators Maximize Market Success. Through candid conversations with health innovators, early adopters, and influencers, you'll learn how to bring your innovation from idea to startup to market domination. And now, let's jump into the latest episode of COIQ. Welcome back to the show, COIQ listeners. On today's episode, we have Farrukh Khan, who is the founder and CEO of Inference Analytics. Welcome to the show, Farrukh.
Hi, Roxy. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's good to have you here. So I always like to start off with having our guests share a little bit about their background and what you've been innovating these days, giving our listeners some context.
Yes. So my background, Roxy, is in the data and analytics space. So, I go back, I'm dating myself a little bit here, but I go back almost to the late 90s where in terms of my first role in the data space, so I was an early stage employee at a company called Informatica, which became a pretty large data analytics company, a data integration company. And then also early stage at a company called MicroStrategy. So worked very closely with the founders of both companies. And then, basically stayed in that data and analytics world until my last actual job was with IBM through an acquisition. So IBM acquired this company called Netezza, and I was part of that acquisition. And I ended up running the Netezza business for distribution sector. And that actually became big data for IBM. So IBM's acquisition led to the creation of what was called big data at that point. Okay. So that's my background, right? I'm somebody who's from the data and analytics space. I've spent all my career understanding the different nuances of how people interplay with data, with software associated with data. And then also now the evolution of data, right? So now you go from analytics or descriptive analytics, as people call it, to now being prescriptive, right? And artificial intelligence, right? So I almost look at it as part of the same journey, if that makes sense. So that's what we're doing now, right? So I've gone from that background into now running this company called Inference Analytics, where we are focused on using data, using specifically unstructured data for the use of improving care or care delivery in healthcare, right? So that's what the company does. It's all about understanding unstructured data in healthcare.
Mm-hmm. So when did you start the company?
So the company was started basically in 2016. The first year and a half was a fair bit of experimentation when I left IBM, figuring out what is the right market for us to play in. But after that point, we found sort of our beachhead, right, which was we found that healthcare, specifically radiology in healthcare, had a lot of very valuable unstructured data. And so that was, you could say, from a pivot standpoint, right? We were experimenting first, and our first real pivot was when we decided we were going to be a company focused on unstructured data in healthcare, specifically starting out with radiology.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
And so, the pandemic that we're all living through has impacted, health innovators like yourself in different forms and fashion. So kind of help us understand, what was maybe some of the nuances or differences between your pre-COVID strategy and kind of where you're going now.
Yeah. So Rocky, it's interesting, right? We, from our core strategy was always focused on understanding text, or what I label like the language of healthcare, and using sort of next generation technology, AI, and the term is deep learning, right? Machine learning type technology to understand the language that is spoken in healthcare, or specifically the text that's written in healthcare. Meaning, understand notes, understand radiology reports. So it's you could look at us as, very simply the next generation of natural language processing, right? NLP is a term that people may know about. So that general approach does not change pre-COVID or now, right? We're doing the same kind of folk type of technology, which is next generation language generation kind of technology. But what has evolved is obviously the use cases, right? And so the use case we started out with, as I mentioned, was very radiology centric, right? So we believe that radiologists write a ton of radiology reports, and there is a lot of improvements you can make in that process to improve the workflow of the radiologist.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't, that has been there. We've kind of created a solution around that, and we have a go-to-market approach for that. What has evolved is that, one of the things we realized was that there were other opportunities that we've always kept our eye on that we wanted to build outside of radiology, and some of those have become a little more apparent now, right? So one of them was, for example, in the clinical notes area, where we wanted to develop a general capability around clinical notes. And so the big thing going on right now in the current climate is there are a lot of clinical trials or vaccine trials, right? And there's the whole process that people and pharmaceutical companies are going through. And so our second use case became sort of obvious to us in the COVID crisis, was that to focus it on clinical trial related solutions, right? So that is one kind of change that we saw pre-COVID versus now, that we hadn't focused on it as much, but now that became a little bit more of an obvious sort of area to look at. So that's one thing. And then the other is we actually developed so you could look at it as long-term and near-term COVID impact. Long-term impact is solution areas like that became more obvious. The clinical notes area and some parts of it specifically related to drug development. The other thing that came up from a near-term perspective in the COVID or sort of in the post-COVID or in the climate that we're in right now was the fact that we actually we've developed sort of solutions that we could give away to the market because we actually had a platform to deal with them. Meaning, as an example, we actually developed a search engine, and it's a search engine we allow anyone to use for free. It's called c19search.com. And the whole idea there is for people to actually go into that search engine and to be able to find published articles related to COVID, right? And the idea there is, as opposed to doing keyword searches, we do what we would call sort of deeper searches, right? So you can look at the semantics of what people are asking and not just look at individual terms. So you have a better chance of finding the right published content, not just any article. So we launched that as a near-term sort of solution. We said, look, there may be a provider, there may be even consumers, right, who want to know more about specific situations related to COVID, whether it's a certain condition or whether it's a certain treatment pattern, right, or whether it's some other sort of related information that they're searching for. And so that was a near-term solution that we just did, and it was very quick for us because we had the overall platform, right? So I mean, I'm giving you two flavors of how COVID has affected us. One is sort of long-term, we're doing the drug kind of oriented play earlier, but then near-term, we actually did some solutions because we thought, hey, we wanted to help, and we could kind of use our current platform to do that.
So walk us through what that journey is like for you as the founder of the company and, leader of the strategy of processing the different options or different paths you could take amidst of COVID and making sure that that you aren't pivoting towards a COVID-centric solution that may not be viable in the long term versus, selecting use cases that have some value and maybe can get new business and paying customers now, this short term versus long term that you described. What is that decision-making process like? What were you wrestling with?
Yeah. So Roxy, I mean, it's obviously like we were talking, right? I mean, there's an element of art to that, right? And it's not just pure science, right? I mean, so we do look at it from a scientific, rational perspective as well, right? When we said, look, we are a bit of a deep technology company, right? I mean, so we have, my co-founder is, he's a machine learning data scientist. He is as part-time faculty at the University of Chicago. So we have that, you could say, academic rigor to a lot of the work that we do in general,
Yeah.
right? When we approached this, we said, look, we're going to not just be all over the place, right? We're going to look at these two markets, and here are the here's the criteria we're going to use to prioritize, right? So it wasn't like, one of the challenges you have in working in a tech company is that you never want to work on technology that will become shelfware, right?
Yeah, right.
Your data scientists will always tell you that. They're like, their biggest fear is that they work on something and then nobody ever uses it, right? And so you almost have to go at it with a preconceived notion of, look, we are doing this as an experiment, right? And this is our core that we've already built in radiology, but these two other markets, we're going to look at them as an experiment and evolve them with that mindset to see which one truly bears fruit, right?
Yep. Yeah.
And so that's almost where we set it up that way. So it's very crystal clear that, you don't put all your eggs in that basket, right? Telling our tech team, having said that, let's do a good job of digging in and understanding the nuances of that specific vertical, right? And so, for example, pharmaceutical drug development area, there's a whole world of data science, right? I mean, there's a huge market where obviously pharmas and all kinds of organizations play into it. And so you don't want to be reinventing the wheel, and you have to find whether there is a niche that you could play in, right? And so the dynamics of that is what we're still figuring out, right? And the way I look at it is, I'm a firm believer in finding strategic partners at all of, within healthcare more so I feel than any other market, because there's a certain pace of how things work in healthcare, and so you need those levers, right? And so what we're doing is, aside from looking at it from a tech and data and technology perspective, where my data scientist is trying to see, hey, can I do a more innovative way of doing something, for example, in clinical trials? In addition to that, what I am weighing is, can I find the right strategic partner in that particular vertical, right? And do I have the relationships? Can I find an advisor or a partner to get me into conversations with the right people? And so we're opportunistically looking at it in that way, right? Knowing full well that these other efforts, one of them may end up being shelfware, right? But we are going in with that mindset, right? So if that makes sense, yeah.
And I think that's really important. So we've talked about this before. There are entrepreneurs out there that have go into the strategy development process with the mindset that they are going to build a single strategy, and this is the strategy, and they go out into the marketplace and they don't really deviate, right? I think health innovators, actually all entrepreneurs, are kind of beat over the head with this baton of like, focus, don't get distracted by the shiny new thing, because that's really easy. But focus on, stay the course on your strategy, when the reality is that there's not going to be a perfect strategy out of the gate. It needs to be an emergent strategy. So what you're doing is, not that your initial strategy was flawed, that you're incapable. It is that you are, going through the exact process as an entrepreneur and innovator that you should, which is finding product market fit and not ignoring new opportunities that can help you scale and get to market faster.
Yeah, and Roxy, that's the, like, that flexibility or that agility behind the right opportunity. That sometimes you do get hung up on, okay, this is what we do and this is how we do it, and we need to just, if you have a certain track record and you believe that that's still going to be around even in the current crisis, then I think it's fair to continue down that path. But I think on the other hand, in how far off you go, right?
Yep.
What you do. I remember talking into like understanding the space outside of radiology, right? And so I had a really good conversation with a guy I'd met, actually JP Morgan. Interesting how the world has changed from JP Morgan week, right? And I make that point to my friend. I was like, we just had this meeting in January. It's not that far back, right? And we met with someone, but that conversation led to several meetings with the CRO. And it's interesting. You're presenting your case for, hey, using AI and trying to figure out if there's an opportunity to partner with someone. But you have to be careful, because sometimes someone who's not in your space will come back and say, hey, I was in the hospital the other day and I saw some other application. It has nothing to do with what we do, right? And you almost have to wear the conversation back and say, okay, wait a second, right? We
Right.
are looking at
Yeah.
you as a different play. Having said that, there's only so far, right, off you want to go from your current base, because that's your core value proposition, right? So I
Yeah.
think that's where the art kind of comes in, because sometimes people will keep guiding you to all kinds of things, right? And especially entrepreneurs, if you're working at an early stage of a company, you're going to meet with early stage people, and they're going to be, very, very dynamic in their thinking, and they'll say, oh, why don't we change that? And you should say, well, yeah, somebody can change it, but that's not what we do, right? We do this part of the problem, and let's focus there. Yeah.
Hey, it's Dr. Roxy here with a quick break from the conversation. Are you trying to figure out what moves you need to make to survive and thrive in the new COVID economy? I want every health innovator to find their most viable and profitable pivot strategy, which is why I created the COVID Proof Your Business Pivot Kit. The Pivot Kit is a step-by-step framework that helps you find your best pivot strategy. It walks you through 6 categories you need to examine for a 360-degree view of your business. I call them the 6 critical pivot lenses. As you make your way through this comprehensive kit, you'll be armed with the tools, tips, and strategies you need to make sure you can pivot with speed without missing out on critical details and opportunities. Learn more at legacy-dna.com/kit. So that is so true, and I think that is the skill that the entrepreneur has to deploy on. At what point do you stay focused and stay the course, and you're not listening to what people say because you know that you're going against the status quo, you're doing something different, and you're staying, persevering and being determined in your path, versus when you are, no, this is a red flag. We're getting customer feedback that this is not relevant or meaningful or valuable to them, and we need to change something, and figuring out which path is best for you. Yeah.
Yeah, it's and that is, you're absolutely right. I mean, like it's almost the classic sort of question people are asking entrepreneurship, right? Like if you ask somebody, in the early 1900s, do they want a faster horse or do they want a car, right? Or they would have said that I want a faster horse, right? And so, do customers really know what they want sometimes,
Yeah.
right? And so but there are differences in that, right? I mean, one is, one example is people have never used something. So until they use it and you get them to use it in a certain way, nobody really knows whether that's valuable yet, right? You don't know, and the customer doesn't know. But on the other hand, if they are using something and they're providing you feedback that something is not working, right?
Right.
Or then that is
Yeah.
different. So I think there has to be a distinction in how you're taking customer feedback, customer sort of, insight, and you're absolutely right. And being able to draw that distinction is very, very important.
Yep. And I think, to your point, that co-creation process is very different if you're talking about an incremental innovation versus whether you're talking about something radical. Like you said, Steve Jobs was never going to invent the iPhone and the iPod, these revolutionary solutions by asking customers, what could we do for you to make your life better? No one was going to come up with, I want 1,000 songs in my pocket. That was just not going to happen. But if you're talking about something that's just incremental, then you can absolutely, and I'm not saying that for a radical innovation, you don't get customer input. It's just the strategy, the mindset, the expectation is just very different. So you used a term recently called Camel Startup. What is that?
Yeah. So it's the opposite of, so the way to think about it is that there's the term that was used pre-COVID was the unicorn, right?
Mm-hmm.
The unicorns of the world, the Ubers or the large organizations, right? That gain tremendous amount of venture capital infusion, right? and enormous, gigantic organizations. And there's the other type of organization that is what I would say very frugal, right, in their approach. And camel being, right, the camel as an animal, right, that can go for long periods of time with little amounts of sort of water or food, right? The Camel Startup is that kind of mindset, right? That look, we are going to be frugal, and in this climate, it becomes harder because if you are a larger organization that is not profitable yet, and you are burning through cash, and it becomes hard to sustain, right? If you can't continue to raise cash. Whereas if you have the mindset of a Camel Startup, you're used to being on a, like you say, being on a diet almost, right? In a consistent basis, and saying, okay, we're going to only drink so much water. We're not going to consume more. We're going to save it for the rainy day, right? For the next phase. I think that's where the Camel Startups, that term has been used around, right? And I kind of label ourselves as the classic Camel Startup because, we've been mindful that, look, we don't necessarily want to raise a lot of capital too early. We want to be careful in when we do that. And then also at the same time, we want to be frugal in how we use any capital that we raise, right? And so what it does is it creates a certain mindset of being in this environment. So, it helps dealing with the COVID crisis, right? Because regardless of what anyone says, looking at this current climate, there are startups who continue to raise money, but it's a different climate, right? If you can't meet someone, if you cannot go to a meeting with an investor, how is someone going to put a lot of capital into a company without ever, sort of meeting the entire team?
Right.
So that dynamic is there. And so I think the Camel Startup is all about that, right? It's about that frugal company that is not hung up on trying to burn too much cash, where employees are on, conscientiously taking less out of the company with a focus on trying to, create something larger in the long run.
So for all our camels out there, what do you need to have in place to realistically have a camel startup? Because I imagine that's very different than if you're a unicorn.
Yeah. So I think the most important thing, Roxy, is that you need to have strategic partners who are willing to sort of, help you grow the company without necessarily having them on your payroll, right? And with almost a commitment for, look, you have a certain core team, and that is somewhat, small, but then you have to have reached a point where other people are willing and want to sort of take that kind of role on, right? Where you have these partners who are saying, look, I want to be part of this. And I know you can't afford it yet because you guys are small, but I actually will almost work as if I'm part of your company. And when and if the time comes, I'd like to join you, right? So you almost want to have those alliances with key people, right, in the industry who or just functionally who can actually help you with the growth of the company. So without necessarily having that full, you could say full-time team, you've got people who are helping you along the way, right? So if I'm being clear here, right? I mean, you want to have more partners than otherwise. From an employee standpoint, you want to leverage people who are believe in your mission, want to join you, but you're not able to get them on board right away. And so you're almost working with that somewhat of a virtual kind of team, right? And in a way, it's similar to the current world, right, that we're in. Everything is a virtual team, and so you're sort of, in a sense, it actually makes it's good to kind of do it now because it's exactly the way the world is operating. Everybody's working in a virtual team. Nobody really sits in front of each other for the most part, right? At least in the tech world or in the data technology world, you don't. And so there's that dynamic, right, where I feel like in the current climate, because so many things are virtual, you can take advantage of how people are used to operating. That helps you and helps them, right? So meaning you can grow a company, you can get someone to help you craft a story without necessarily having them fully on board with a commitment that, they're going to be rewarded, sooner or later, right? And, or you can have different types of terms with them. But I think that's how I look at it as a Camel startup, taking advantage of the virtual world that we're in, not necessarily having full-time employees, being very frugal in how you use whatever cash that you have. So those are the elements that kind of go into it versus a unicorn, right? Is you hire gigantic teams, right, that you're now managing and you're operating on, and that is all part of your payroll and part of your overall mandate.
Mm-hmm. How important is, your, so we're going to get personal here for a minute. How important is your support network in your personal life?
Yeah, it's the, and I joke with my wife about this, right? I mean, we're into this for the fourth year now, right? And as a company, and I made a conscientious decision to leave a pretty stable executive kind of job at IBM to go and do this. Now, I did this because I've been part of entrepreneurship before, and it was something that's hard to kind of let go of. But yeah, I mean, going back to how important it is unfathomable, right? That anybody can do it without that support system. I mean, if you have to make sacrifices along the way, and you're saying, okay, we're not going on that type of vacation this year, or we're not doing
right.
And your kids kind of get impacted too. So it's very important, right? I mean, it cannot be done, and I almost your first investor really is your, if you have a family, right, is your significant other or your spouse, right, is your first investor, right? And they're probably the biggest investor in this, right? And so, yeah, I mean, that support network is as important as that, right? I mean, they are the core investor in your vision. And so if you don't have that, it's almost, it's very hard.
Especially when you're talking about times like this where you're evaluating pivots, right? And you're saying, hey, honey, I'm just going to envision being in your kitchen for a minute. Hey, honey, so we've been working at this for 4 years. And so I know I've been talking about radiology for the last 4 years, but we're pivoting to a different use case. And so I'm going to have maybe some different investors, or I'm going to have some different team members that I need, or some different partnerships and alliances. So this is going to take a little bit longer than I thought. Maybe not, but I'm just hypothetically, proposing what a conversation might look like. And really, I imagine that to be able to have that kind of conversation, that family member's support is critical for you to feel confident and encouraged and being able to pivot and adjust in the new path.
Yeah. So, and on that one, Roxy, I mean, we're from a pivoting standpoint, because we have not, it's not like we have pivoted away from radiology. We just, we have radiology as a use case where we built that into a solution that we're now have a strategic partner pushing. So there's limited amount that we can do outside of leveraging that strategic partnership, right? Because we feel like, look, it took us 1.5 years to get to this partnership. It was interesting. We signed a deal with a strategic partner, almost 2 weeks into the lockdown, right? So, we had that, but it took us almost a year before that, right, to get to that. So we were lucky that we had that. And my call was that, look, at this point in this environment, the best thing we can do is to continue to build this partnership, right, without necessarily going too much outside, because everybody else is going to be so focused. So we maintain that as one of our cores, right? Core use cases or core markets. But then we looked at these other and other two, right? And it was interesting, right? Because I think it depends upon your support system. I mean, for me, my wife is not really, a question like some of these decisions, right? I do talk about it, but in a way it becomes more tangible, right? To say, look, what we're doing is actually very relevant in the COVID crisis. So but you're right. I mean, if I were to say, hey, we're going to start from scratch ground zero because of the COVID crisis, now that would be a different conversation. Right?
And you're not in that situation, but there are other folks that are listening and watching the show today who are trying to figure out how are they going to break the news.
Yeah, no, that's hard, and at some point, you also have to have a business perspective on this, right? Like, what is, like, rationally put yourself in the shoes of an investor, or put yourself in the shoes of your wife or your spouse who's an investor in you, right? And say, okay, how rational is this, right? And is it really possible to do it? Now, if it is possible, and you say, look, I have this opportunity, and because I think at the end of the day, in any new pivot or market that you decide to adopt, you have to have a tangible reason for why you're doing it, right? Either you found a client who said, look, I'm going to pay X for you guys to work on this, right? And that may be a little different than what you were doing, and then you can rationalize it and say, look, that's why we're doing it, right? Or
cash flow.
right? Or something else comes up, right? Where somebody says, look, I'm going to give you access to some data that no one has, and that will give you a clear edge and almost an advantage over everybody else. And that could be another reason where you say, look, I have this relationship with this major system, right? And no one has been able to tap into it, but because of how I've been able to navigate that system, I get access to that. Now that is almost currency, right? Where somebody's given you that. So when you make those choices or you make those pivots, it cannot be just based on a whim that, hey, I think there's something there.
Right.
It almost needs to be, hey, I'm thinking that, but now I've been proven that there is something because of this tangible, either revenue opportunity or some other strategic asset that I was able to get, right? So, I mean, that's how I look at it, right? And you know, I say that about put yourself in the shoes of an investor. At some point, you also have to be mindful of, okay, what kind of, you know, sort of how long can you sustain it, right? I mean, how real is this? Who, you know, can you keep going on in this vein for a longer time, and will you be able to survive? So, you know, those are rational decisions that have to be made, right?
Yeah, completely. So Farrukh, what advice do you have, as we wrap up here, what advice do you have for our listeners and viewers who are, you know, in the trenches, very similar to you, day in and day out, facing some, you know, common challenges and also crossing some common opportunities?
Yeah, I think, Rocky, the main you know, advice would be to think clearly about what you offer, right? And be objective and this, you know, make sure that you know, you have a good rational reason to continue, right? And it has to be based on business. It has to be a non-emotional kind of decision, right? Where you either you've already achieved something, you're like, wow, this is it would be wrong to now, you know, not continue to do this. But then, you know, so that's the first thing. But then the second thing is, you know, entrepreneurship is not easy, right? This is not it's the hardest job, right? And to try to figure out you know, opportunities in a market like this where things are closed, there are opportunities. I mean, in this climate, there are certain things that suddenly boomed, right? And so you could have picked up on that. But on the other hand, you have to still stay closer to your core, because you can't completely retool. I feel like there's an element of retooling that you could do to adjust, but how far do you take that? Like, you know, you can't suddenly say, hey, I'm going to give up. Like, for example, if we were to say, you know, we're a data and analytics AI company, and then we decided to be some other type of software that had nothing to do with that, I don't think that would be fair to ourselves, right? Like, you know, you're not taking advantage of the value proposition we offer.
That's not a pivot. That's a new business.
That's a new business, right? Yeah. And so how far do you take that, right? And so I think it's important to understand your core and important to be objective. And then, you know, for those of us who've seen the previous crisis, you know, we're hopeful that there is light at the end of the tunnel here, right? And I think that's important, because in this climate, you'd be surprised at how things can kind of open up in a different way. I mean, there could be more opportunity in one thing or the other, but being dynamic in your thought process is important, right? And as you pointed out, like, you know, when you're thinking about a pivot or thinking about a different market, be dynamic, talk to as many people as possible. I think is the most important thing that I've learned is, like have your ear to the ground, right? And reach in, not necessarily trying to sell, but, reach
Right.
your advisor pool, your potential customers, your partners, and ask them, well, what are you seeing? Like, what has changed, right? How are things evolving? And also, to make sure that you're not out of touch, right? Like if you go in and saying, hey, I'm going to improve productivity by 30%, and people are like, I'm barely working,
Right, exactly.
what more, you can't make me more productive. I want to work, right? So you have to make sure your message is on par with the current environment.
Yeah, completely. So Farrukh, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with our listeners today and your experience. I so appreciate your time today. How can our listeners and viewers get a hold of you if they want to follow up with you after the show?
Yeah, I think the easiest way would be the company's name is inferenceanalytics.com, right? So my name is just my first name at inferenceanalytics.com, or through the website. I mean, that's the best way to do it. And yeah, I'm always open to, talking to more people. I think that's the job of CEOs, to talk to as many people as possible. And yeah, so that's the best way, right? Email would be the best way to do it.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Roxy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. I know you're busy working to bring your life-changing innovation to market, and I value your time and your attention. To save time and get the latest episodes on your mobile device automatically, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher. Thank you for listening, and I appreciate everyone who's been sharing the show with friends and colleagues. See you on the next episode of COIQ.